Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Vraks, where Marshal Arnim Kagori has been procrastinating. He has gone through every single little piece of work and detail and letter and report he could get his hands on before he finally had nothing else to do but to open one last letter left on his desk. Adorned with the stylized A of the Adeptus Administratum, this single piece of paper was something the Marshal feared more than all the armies of the traitor Cardinal, for it was capable of doing more damage to his campaign than any horde of traitors had ever managed. For the merciless, cold calculations of the Adeptus Administratum were starting to show that perhaps the war on Vraks was simply not worth the investment. By the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army's own estimates, they had inflicted something along the lines of 3 to 4 million casualties upon the Vraxian defenders. And originally, the apostate Cardinal's world of Vraks held a total of 8 million souls. By any normal estimate and rules of warfare, this would mean that the Cardinal's military forces would be standing at the absolute brink of annihilation, having used up virtually all eligible manpower of fighting age. However, this was not a normal war, and the apostate Cardinal had been reinforced by further Chaos worshippers. The real problem, of course, was not their numbers. At worst, the traitors had brought maybe 1 million men in all, and that was the most pessimistic of estimates. Whilst this certainly would be a valuable influx of manpower, it would not be decisive. What was far more worrying, however, was the fact that the Death Corps were constantly sending out further reports of what appeared to be freshly armed and armoured civilians assaulting their lines. This meant that the heretics were no longer poor, misguided imperial citizens tricked by the apostate Cardinal. It meant that they had been well and truly corrupted by the Chaos Gods, and as such the usual distinctions between civilian and military personnel had all virtually vanished. And so, whilst normally Vraks would stand at the very edge of collapse, having used virtually all of its manpower reserves, the truth was quite different. Because Vraks was not drawing merely upon its reserves of able-bodied fighting-age males. With the introduction of chaos and its corrupting influence, every single man, woman, child, young or old on Vraks was now a mortal enemy of the Imperium of Man, and would have to be wiped out to the last. And so, far from tittering at the edge of annihilation, the apostate Cardinal still had well over half of his manpower reserves still intact. And that was, of course, before we even take into consideration the additional reinforcements that had arrived from off-world. And the worst part was yet to come. Whilst once the defenders of Vraks had been mere militiamen and labourers, expected to be unable to stand up to the fury of the Death Corps of Krieg, that time had long since passed. The defenders of Vraks were now hardened combat veterans, elites hardened in a crucible of war that had lasted for more than a decade. And then, of course, there were the Chaos Space Marine forces. Whilst the defenders themselves had grown into a formidable fighting force, they were still as children when compared to their most powerful allies. The Chaos Space Marines, under the command of Cornet Warlord Zephyr and the Alpha Legion traitor, Lord Arcos. The war's nature had changed drastically. The parameters were no longer the same, and the initial deadline of 12 years had come and passed. Whilst it was undisputable that the introduction of Marshal Arnim Kagori had introduced a brand new impetus to the war, and that he had achieved results that Lord Commander Jolke had not, the results still unfortunately fell well short of the intended outcome, namely, of course, the ending of the war on Vraks. As such, the Departamento Munitorum and Adeptus Administratum found it necessary to conduct a lengthy review of the war overall. This report would take over a year to complete and compile, but at the end of it, the conclusion was inescapable. The war on Vraks had taken longer than expected, and whilst originally the Administratum was willing to overlook the breach of the deadline due to the progress made by Marshal Arnim Kagori, now, 2 years after the 12-year period had passed, they had come to the conclusion that the maintenance of the siege on Vraks at its current intensity was no longer sustainable. The men and produce of Krieg were needed on other battlefields, and the strain upon the Segmentum's supply system could no longer be justified. Thusly, despite his protests, Marshal Kagori was instructed to start limiting his offensive operations and scaling down the war on Vraks. This was, however, as of yet, at least, not a defeat. Marshal Arnim Kagori had not been ordered to abandon the effort of breaking Vraks. It was merely a downscaling of the Administratum and the Departamento Munitorum's support for the war, and an instruction to see if other potential avenues for ending the war could not be found or at the very least explored. One suggestion was that perhaps another attempt upon the Cardinal's life could be made by the Officio Assassinorum. Another suggestion was that the Cardinal himself was probably already dead, and now the war was being run by his ex-lackeys, or possibly even the newly arrived Chaos Space Marine warlords. Either way, it was theorized that a small commitment by the Officio Assassinorum might end the war where millions of guardsmen had not been able to. The Marshal, of course, argued that he had no authority over the Officio Assassinorum, and that he had so far used all of the forces available to him in every way he could conceivably think of. He was not aware of anything else that could be done on his part to expedite the war effort. His objections, however, did him little good. The Adeptus Administratum envoy simply shrugged and informed the Marshal that the papers had already been signed and stamped by the Administratum. And however the Lord Marshal wished to proceed now that he had been informed of that fact was none of the Administratum's business, nor did they care to make it part of their business. Finally, the Lord Marshal was informed that he now had another 5 years to bring the war on Vraks to a successful conclusion before another Adeptus Administratum and Munitorum review would be carried out, whereupon they would decide if any new actions were required to be taken on their behalf. The implication was clear. If Marshal Kagori could not bring the war to an end in another 5 years, then the Administratum would yet further reduce his access to men, supplies, and materiel, making a situation that was already starting to look frighteningly hopeless even worse. And so, the Administratum envoy turned on his heels and marched out of the Marshal's office, leaving behind a positively fuming Arnim Kagori. For all his initial success on the Vraxian battlefield, the true aftertaste of the poisoned chalice he had been handed was finally starting to set in. As the Adeptus Administratum, with but a pen stroke, inflicted upon the Marshal a greater loss than the traitors had managed in years. And there is no arguing with the Adeptus Administratum, and so Marshal Kagori would have to start looking for the alternative solutions that the Administratum was demanding, whilst also remaining suspiciously quiet as to what those solutions might be precisely. Fortunately, there was one alternative quite nearby. Marshal Kagori immediately began sending out delegates to various forces he hoped to enlist across the segmentum, and one of the first that he got in contact with was also a rather promising one. In the relatively nearby Cantus system, there was an Adeptus Astartes strike cruiser, the Arx Fidelis. It had just recently returned from a patrol sweep through the Fide Nebula, and was utilizing the Imperial Navy facilities in the sector to rearm and resupply. At this point in time, the Arx Fidelis was home to 100 battle brothers, led by Commander Aina of the 3rd Company of the Red Scorpions chapter. Under him, he had elements of the 3rd, 6th, and 8th Companies, along with a small formation of Terminator elites from the 1st Company. This formation had been engaged in anti-piracy activity against a force of Orc freebooters operating in the area. They had also recently located and destroyed an Orc pirate stronghold, and were now set to conduct several more operations against the pirates before they were finally at liberty to return back to their chapter fortress. And it was at this point that Marshal Kagori's envoys arrived upon the scene, and requested an audience with Commander Aina, which was granted with all due ceremony. The Marshal's envoys then briefed the Red Scorpion's commander on all of the peculiarities of the currently ongoing war. They informed him about the current state of affairs, including the fact the Adeptus Administratum would be cutting back on their support for the war effort. The envoys painted a bleak picture indeed of the Imperium's position upon the long-besieged world of Vraks, and it is clear that the commander of the Red Scorpions was somewhat hesitant and skeptical to whether or not he wanted to involve his battle brothers in this seemingly endless grinding conflict. For whilst, as a commander of the Red Scorpions, Aina had full authority to commit his battle brothers, he would not do so before first consulting with his superiors. It was, however, a victory in and of itself that he would even do so in the first place. The fact that the Red Scorpion commander would review the situation and take it to his Lord High Commander was at the very least an indication that the Scorpions were not entirely hostile to the prospect. Nevertheless, it was clearly not a foregone conclusion, and it would take several months before Marshal Kagori would finally receive a reply. But when he did, it was, thank the God Emperor, a positive one. The Lord High Commander of the Red Scorpions had agreed to deploy Commander Aina and his strike force to Vraks. It did, however, come with a condition. No Red Scorpion was ever to be placed under the command of anyone but their own officers. This, however, wasn't even all that much of a request, really. The Adeptus Astartes are, by their very nature, beyond the authority of the Imperial Guard to command. And hell, it's not like this would even be the first completely independent formation to be operating in the Marshal's area of purview without taking any instructions or orders from him. The Titans of Legio Astorum were already doing whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. So, at this point in time, if Marshal Kagori could gain access to a formation of super heavy infantry like the Adeptus Astartes, and the only price for that formation was that he couldn't directly give them orders, well, it seemed a small price to pay. And so, after a few more months of warp travel, the Arx Fidelis finally arrived in the Vraxian system, and coasted majestically to the planet itself, undisturbed by any things that may or may not be lurking in the system at the time. Upon the strike cruiser's arrival, the commanders of the Red Scorpion's force requested that they be given thorough briefings from Krieg personnel as to the precise situation on the planet at the time of their arrival. And frankly, the situation had changed very little from that of the previous episode. The Death Corps of Krieg had been kept busy by the Vraxian defenders' constant counterattacks upon their line corps. This meant that they could no longer dedicate the required numbers of personnel and materiel to continuously assault the breach points, especially considering their very limited results so far. The stagnant situation did, however, not intimidate the Red Scorpions, who viewed it instead as a mere clarification and simplification of their duties on Vraks. The Red Scorpion officers had undoubtedly feared that they would be spread thin across the battle line, finding it necessary to launch multiple small-scale offensives to grab this or that piece of strategic terrain. Gain a hill here, knock out a bunker complex there, storm a fortress way over there. All important strategic objectives, don't get me wrong, but they were the kind of things that would eventually kill the enemy by 1,000 cuts. Low intensity, low risk, low reward operations. If they were to engage in such things, the Red Scorpions would be stuck on Vraks for a very, very long time indeed. With the breach point, however, things were made, so much more simple. All they needed was to take the breach. Granted, yes, it was one of the most heavily defended and fortified areas on the entire planet at this point, but that was not considered to be all too much in the way of a problem. If the Adeptus Astartes only had to overcome impossible odds once for a decisive advantage, they would happily do so. It was, at the very least, a far better option than having to overcome impossible odds a dozen times over, all for minuscule gains. And so the Red Scorpion's officers retreated back to their strike cruiser to plan how to best execute their assault upon the breach. For whilst they were grateful for the clarity of purpose that it brought them, they were under no illusions that taking it would be damn difficult. The breach had resisted several large-scale attempts by the Death Corps of Krieg to take it, and those attempts had even been supported by the Titans of Legio Astorum. The breach point was by no means a soft target, but the Red Scorpions had access to something that neither the Death Corps or even the God Machines could boast. Their strike cruiser, the Arx Fidelis, was equipped with a teleportarium. And this ancient, barely understood mechanical marvel would allow the Red Scorpions to avoid plodding their happy little power-armored asses all the way up to the walls, whilst continuously being fired at by the wall defenses. Instead, they planned to insert a strike team of First Company Terminator elites directly into the breach itself, with virtually no warning given to the defenders. The plan was dubbed the Execution Phase, and would be carried out in 4 phases, the first of which called for the insertion of an assault team directly into the breach via Thunderhawk transport. The transport would roar down from low orbit, initiating a steep dive directly towards the breach, pulling up at the last second whilst disgorging its small squad of assault marines, who would slow their terminal velocity descent by using jump packs. Relying on complete surprise along with the shock and awe of their arrival, they would buy just enough time to place down a teleportation homer. This device was almost as ancient as the teleportarium itself, and it, when placed, would rapidly begin scanning the surrounding terrain and uploading that data to the strike cruiser in real time. This would allow the teleportarum to place the Terminators with pinpoint precision on the ground without risking unfortunate mishaps like, for example, teleporting half of a Terminator brother inside of a particularly large chunk of masonry, which would lead to some rather lethal consequences for the poor battle brother. And with the safe arrival of the Terminator elites guaranteed by the teleportation beacon, the Terminators could then enter the fray in the second phase of the operation, where Commander Einar and Codisir Yaek would personally lead the First Company's veterans into battle. The hulking Red Scorpion Space Marines, clad in tactical dreadnought armor, would then immediately set about cleansing the breach of any and all immediate resistance. And whilst that was going on, they would also dispatch a message to a Red Scorpion's armored spearhead that will have been transported down to the planet previously, under the cover of darkness. Upon receiving the message, this armored formation would rush forward as swiftly as possible, gunning their overcharged engines to close the distance with the breach whilst the enemy was still reeling from the sudden appearance of the Terminators. And upon reaching the breach, the Red Scorpion's rhinos would disgorge their own complement of tactical marines, who would then rapidly rush up the breach in huge, superhuman power-armoured strides and dig in alongside the First Company veterans. The Red Scorpions would then repulse any and all immediate Vraxian counterattacks, and once they felt confident in their ability to hold the breach, they would call in the 88th Army's 11th Assault Corps, along with the Titans of Religio Astorum. These would then swiftly move up and take over command of the breach from the Red Scorpions, who would then withdraw and return to orbit. The 11th Assault Corps and the Titans would then initiate the fourth and final phase of operations, where they would pour through the breach and begin to expand upon it. The plan sounded simple enough. First, a rapid insertion of a forward team, followed by the arrival of the Terminator elites, followed shortly thereafter by a rush of armoured elements across the lines towards the breach, which would hold it against the Vraxian counterattack, and then finally the arrival of the 11th Assault Corps and the Titans of Religio Astorum. It would, however, require perfect precision and coordination between the various elements. Since most of the plan was up to the Astartes forces, this was not considered a problem. In fact, this level of coordination and timing was considered to be a given whenever the God Emperor's finest warriors were involved. On his part, Marshal Kogori had no misgivings whatsoever about the plan presented to him by Commander Einar, and promised that the 11th Assault Corps would stand ready to support Strike Force Einar in any way that they required. The Titans of Legio Astorum would also stand ready to support their most honourable brothers in the Adeptus Astartes, High Princeps Drauka himself not only agreeing to the plan, but also vowing to lead his own Reaver-class Titan, the Praetorian, in support of the strike group. The operation was set to begin on 98-26 Millennia 41, with Commander Einar spending a full day in preparation for it, in prayer, kneeling before the Emperor's altar aboard the strike cruiser. He had already organized the various officers who would be in charge of the operation. The leader of the assault troops that were to deploy ahead of the Terminators into the breach would be Sergeant Cullen of the 8th Company. The commander in charge of the armoured spearhead that was to rush to the aid of his Terminator elites was veteran Sergeant Zir of the 6th Company. And leading the Terminators themselves, of course, would be Commander Einar himself, assisted directly by Codisir Yaek. The strike force would also be joined by 3 of the chapter's most venerable members, the Dreadnoughts, ex-chaplain Nair, and the venerable brothers Razasa and Daeris. And finally, as pretty much the last to know, the human captain of the strike cruiser Arx Fidelis was informed of his role in all of this. He would command the strike cruiser in a rapid sweep towards the Vraxian citadel, enduring the fire of its many laser defense batteries for long enough to dispatch the Thunderhawk transport and also the Terminator elites themselves, who would be operating out of the teleportarium. As soon as this was done, the strike cruiser was to make all speed out of range of the Vraxian defense lasers. It was a risk, certainly, but a calculated one. The Arx Fidelis was an ancient and venerable vessel, with powerful void shields and hundreds of meters of solid armor. If there was any ship that could survive the battering the Vraks could put out, at least temporarily, it would be the Arx Fidelis. And so, the operation began. First, the Thunderhawk gunship bearing the 5 volunteers, including Sergeant Cullen, exited the Arx Fidelis and headed down for the planet below. Shortly thereafter, the strike cruiser was buffeted by the first impacts upon its void shields by the laser defense batteries of Vraks. The strike cruiser would have to endure this barrage for a fair while, whilst the Thunderhawk slipped down into the atmosphere below and raced as quickly as possible towards the breach, staying low and super fast, utilizing all of the velocity it had built up from its descent from orbit to send it slingshotting towards the breach at no more than 100 feet above ground. Already standing ready at its rearward assault ramp, Sergeant Cullen's volunteer squad stood with their boots mag-locked to the deck, awaiting the split-second moment when the Thunderhawk would shoot through the breach and they would jump off its rearward ramp into the darkness below. The moment soon came, and without a second of hesitation, the assault squad leapt from the back of the speeding transport and began their rapid descent towards the breach, not activating their jump packs before the very last second, trusting in their power armor and a reinforced superhuman physique to allow them to survive the descent. The howling roar of the triple jet engines of the Thunderhawk zooming low over the breach inevitably woke up the Vraxian defenders, who were not immediately aware of the intruders in their midst. But it didn't take long before they'd noticed the huge power-armored forms in the middle of the breach, placing a suspicious-looking beacon upon the ground. They quickly began firing upon Cullen and his squad. One of the assault marines went down with a crack grenade, impacting directly upon his chest piece and blowing him virtually in half. Another Space Marine was soon wounded with his helmet punctured and shattered, leaving him bare-faced in the night. Cullen launched a counter-attack against the Vraxians closing in from every direction. With the beacon set, the squad's duty now was to buy enough time for the Terminators to lock onto it and teleport down, without allowing the Vraxians to disturb the delicate and ancient mechanism. Aboard the Arx Fidelis, the teleportarium literally shook as the venerable old ship was buffeted by repeated strikes upon his void shields, who eventually started to fail and give out, leading to more and more hits passing through the protective void shield umbrella and impacting upon the vessel's monstrously thick armored hide. But Commander Aina refused to allow the teleportation to take place before he got a strong signal from the surface. He was confident that his sergeant would complete his mission, and soon enough a loud, shrill tone signaled that the teleportarium had got a solid lock on the beacon. Immediately, Aina gave the order to initiate the teleportation, and after a swift yet still sickening trip through the warp, Aina and his Terminators arrived in the breach in a flash of lightning and a thunderclap of displaced air. The First Company veterans, immediately upon arriving, began firing their weapons and formed into 2 wedges that began pushing their way inexorably up the breach, the defenders' fire pattering harmlessly off their massively reinforced tactical dreadnought armor. Most of the Terminators were armed with their standard equipment, Power Fist and Storm Bolters, But some had been equipped with storm shields, thunder hammers, and lightning claws to cut a swathe through the defenders, who were now confused and unaware of exactly what it was they were fighting. All they knew was that their fire appeared to have little, if any, effect whatsoever, and that the encroaching enemy themselves were laying down a tremendous weight of fire. The Vraksians improvised positions in the breach, simply just disappearing under a hailstorm of miniature explosions. Meanwhile, just as the first company's elites were fighting for the breach, Sergeant Zir and his battle brothers were advancing towards the breach in their souped-up rhinos. Their advance, however, was cut short, as it was made clear to them that the Vraksians had not been lazy. They must have ventured out from the breach in the middle of the night to put up tank traps and move huge boulders knocked loose from the original and secondary explosion to bar the passage to the breach itself. Ordering his men to disembark their rhinos and complete the advance on foot, Sergeant Zir himself joined the battle line as the Red Scorpions formed up and began advancing doggedly yet swiftly towards the breach. Behind them, the armoured and mechanized elements of the Red Scorpions would begin clearing a path for both their own armour and the 11th Assault Corps that was to follow them. Vindicators began opening fire on the enemy's curtain walls, whilst the Dreadnought, armed with rock drills and multi-melters, began smashing apart and melting the larger bolters, and then pushing the slagged or shattered remains out of the way. This did, however, mean that the armoured spearhead had surrendered any hope of a swift and surprising approach to the curtain walls, and they were soon placed under a sustained and vicious barrage from the wall guns. Massive wall-mounted searchlights beginning to play out into no man's land and identifying the nature of their attackers, locking Dreadnought and Vindicators in unyielding beams of light, which swiftly brought with it a hailstorm of anti-tank weaponry. Meanwhile, the first company received its first countercharge. The enemy were trying to counter their unknown assailants by using the same trick that had worked so well against the Death Court of Krieg, hurling a solid wall of monstrous battle-drugged Ogrins down the slope towards the invaders. But this time, the unstoppable force met an equally and even more so unyielding object in a wall of Terminator armor. This time, when an Ogren came barreling down the slope, a swing of a mighty thunderhammer would send the monstrosity flying right back up it again. Their crude patchwork plasteel armor providing no protection from the Terminator's power fists, power swords, thunderhammers, lightning claws, and storm bolters. Neither did their drug-fueled physique do them much good in resisting the damage suffered upon their bodies by the repeated impacts of stormbolter rounds, each impact blasting fist-sized holes in the abhuman monsters. While fighting their way up the breach against the Ogren counterattack, the Terminators also happened across the last surviving member of the advance team. Sergeant Cullen, standing at the top of the breach, bloodied, wounded, and wielding his chainsword in both hands, was still alive, and would, for his heroic actions this day, later be elevated to the chapter's first company. And soon the Terminator elites were themselves joined by Sergeant Zir and ex-chaplain Nair, who had made their way up the breach after traversing the last distance on foot in the face of the enemy's wall guns, firing rapid-fire but precise bolt-round shots as they went, wrecking wall-mounted defense systems and leaving the larger weapons for the Vindicators to deal with. Now fully reinforced and in accordance to plan, Commander Einar issued the order to dig in and prepare to defend the breach against all comers. Feeling confident that his Red Scorpions would be able to do just that, he also sent the Mission All Clear signal to the 11th Assault Corps and the Titans of Legio Astorum, who immediately began moving up in support of the Astartes' forward elements. The Red Scorpions had succeeded in taking the breach, Now, the question was whether or not they would be able to hold it. Because, of course, the enemy was well aware of how vital that breach was, and had long since prepared plans to defend it and retake it if necessary. They had already played their trump card of detonating the breach after it had been seized by the 8th Assault Corps. That trick was not available to be used twice. What they did have, however, was a rapid response force of primarily mechanized Chimera-mounted infantry and armored elements. And this formation was immediately set in motion upon receiving the news that the breach had fallen. And along with them, they also brought their heaviest reserves, the Titans of Legio Volcanum. And as the day began to dawn upon the breach, the Red Scorpions, still ensconced at the top of it, were preparing themselves to receive the Vraxians in as warm and festive a manner as they were able to, but before that they had to deal with another, far less welcome guest. The enemy's artillery batteries had been caught off guard and unprepared for the Red Scorpions' sudden lightning assault upon the breach, and had played little in the way of a role in denying them their assault. Now, however, that the breach itself was free of Vraxian forces and occupied only by the Red Scorpions, there was nothing whatsoever stopping every single Vraxian artillery piece within range from plastering it mercilessly and without stop. The Vraxian commander in charge of the rapid reaction forces were clearly of the opinion that whatever was awaiting him and his men at the top of that breach, it needed some softening up before he ordered his men to charge. And so the Red Scorpions had to endure hours of near constant heavy bombardment from an unknown number of heavy caliber guns, raining fragmentation and high explosive shells down upon them non-stop. It became such an intense bombardment that even the power armor of the Astartes and the tactical dreadnought armor of the First Company veterans were not enough to keep them all safe, and they had to begin erecting their own hastily created barricades and improvised shelters, utilizing the debris of the breach to shield them from the worst of the bombardment. And even so, many battle brothers met an untimely and unworthy end at the hands of high explosive shells fired kilometers away. Behind the breach, on the recently crossed plains below, the engineering companies of the 11th Assault Corps had been working throughout the night, clearing obstacles, setting demolition charges, and providing the heavy armor and mechanized element of the 11th Assault Corps a clear route of approach to the breach. And by dawn, most of these routes were just about ready to be opened. Additionally, both light and heavy support artillery pieces had been brought up during the night, emplaced, supplied, and made ready for immediate action the next day. This was a very risky move on behalf of the Death Corps of Krieg. They were throwing everything into the success of this operation. If, by any chance, they were repulsed, a considerable portion of the 88th, the Imperial Guard Siege Army's armored elements and artillery would be left completely and utterly exposed to the enemy's wall gunners and their retargeted artillery batteries. If this failed, the 11th Assault Corps would incur some of their heaviest casualties it had ever experienced in the Vraxian War so far. And with the reduced rate of reinforcement and materiel streaming in from Krieg, that was not something the 88th could afford. The Red Scorpions had not been idle during the night either. The dreadnoughts had worked tirelessly to clear paths through the rubble for the smaller, more maneuverable Adeptus Astartes armored elements, and they had also been brought, at least in part, up to the top of the wall. Lighter pieces like Razorback and Rhinos would add their own not inconsiderable firepower to the defense, whilst also providing relatively artillery-immune shelters within which the Astartes could hide. One of these vehicles, however, a Razorback, did not last long, as it became the first casualty of a very, very long day indeed, as it took a direct hit from a volcano cannon mounted on an unknown god machine of Legio Volcanum. The hit quite literally vaporized the Astartes IFV, and sent huge shards of white-hot shrapnel flying in every direction. Chaplain Naller was particularly unlucky as he found himself smack dab in the path of one of these large pieces, who took his arm clean off. That first volcano cannon hit was to be the opening shot in the Vraxians' counterattack, and their first major attempt to reclaim the breach since losing it to the Red Scorpions. And the Astartes would immediately have reason to be thankful for the fact that the Krieg Assault Corps had committed so much to their defense. Due to the heavy concentration of Death Cord artillery right behind the breach, the enemy's Titan's void shields immediately began flickering with repeated artillery impacts, and the waves of light and heavy infantry transports scurrying around their feet were already beginning to wander into the killing field of the 88's artillery. And even as a company apothecary was rushing over to treat Chaplain Naller, several of the enemy's light vehicles were already on fire, struck by the overwhelming Krieg artillery barrage placed in their path. The barrage did, however, not stop nor even noticeably slow the incoming onslaught of Vraxians. The real problem, however, were the enemy's Titans. The Red Scorpions had dug themselves in well and were prepared to repulse, in their opinion, any traitor assault. The Titans of Legio Volcanum, however, they might be the exception, as their super heavy weaponry would make short work of even the Emperor's finest. Luckily, the Titans of Legio Astorum had also dedicated their support to the Astartes' cause, and striding out from the billowing smoke and dust behind the Astartes came High Princeps Drauca's Praetorian. Flanked by two smaller Warhound Titan, the towering Reaver class immediately made for the breach itself, which had, by the efforts of the Vraxians themselves in detonating the second mine, been so reduced that the Reaver-class Titan could simply stride right through it. Satisfied that the Titans would now have one of their own to play with, Commander Aina focused his attention upon the closing Vraxian infantry formations, and issued orders to his Devastators and Tactical Marines to begin engaging the enemy, whilst Aina himself and his Terminators would fall back for the moment, forming a counter-attack formation of Terminator elites along with the remaining assault elements of his strike force. They would later be used to riposte all enemy formations that made it to the breach. For the first few minutes, the Red Scorpions had to hold out alone against the encroaching Vraxian armor, but slowly but surely, the Assault Corps began to stream into and eventually out of the crater. The first Death Corps vehicle to climb up the lip of the crater and make it out onto the Vraxian side was a Shadow Sword of the Super Heavy companies, and it was swiftly followed by more of its kin, swiftly followed by all manners of light, heavy, and medium armored vehicles. Whilst this was going on, the Death Corps engineers had moved into the crater, and were busy blasting open new roads in the crater's lip and building ramps up to it for the less powerful vehicles to drive up. This allowed the lighter armoured elements carrying grenadiers and guardsmen to join the heavy armoured elements as they began pushing out of the crater and into the Vraxian counterattack. The Death Corps would not be satisfied with merely holding the breach and being bottled up within it. As always, the plan was to push through the breach and force the enemy to react. If a sufficient threat towards the citadel could be created, the enemy would have no choice but to abandon its long stretched out defenses and concentrate them all in preventing the Death Corps from decapitating their command structure. This was, however, easier said than done. The Vraxians knew what was at stake, and they were throwing everything at checking the Death Corps' advance through the crater, and even on several occasions attempted to outright reverse the Death Corps' fortunes. Several attempts were made to storm the breach, and many of them made it so far as into the crater itself, where Commander Aina himself led repeated counterattacks with his first company elites and assault elements to repel the Vraxians from the crater lip. In one of these engagements, Commander Aina was grievously wounded by a plasma weapon. The super heavy plates of his tactical dreadnought armor saved his life, but in the process, the armor itself was split asunder, and the commander was left with severe burn wounds across most of his torso. And despite his grievous injuries and barely clinging on to consciousness, the commander was still issuing orders as he was quite literally dragged from the field by apothecaries. After this, command of the Red Scorpion strike force fell to veteran Sergeant Zir, who continued to lead the Red Scorpions throughout the day as the Death Corps' 11th Assault Corps continued to pour yet further forces into and out of the crater. The massive tank battle raged for the remainder of the day until finally, mercifully, once more night fell upon the tortured world of Vraks and forced both sides to retreat. The results of the day's fighting was that an equilibrium had eventually been reached. The 11th Assault Corps was able to push out of the immediate crater rim, but could not launch a serious assault into the Vraxians' own lines. Meanwhile, the Vraxians, despite several brave attempts, could not break through either the flanks or the center of the Death Corps or the Red Scorpions' positions, and as such could not regain their position within the breach itself. This was a de facto victory for the Death Corps, because during the night and during the next day they could continue to pump reinforcements of manpower, armor, and improvised defensive positions in through the breach, whilst bringing up yet further independent artillery companies to cover the approaches. For the Vraxians, however, they had played their strongest hand. The rapid reaction force was supposed to be enough to counter any Death Corps breach. But unfortunately for it was not called upon to counter merely a Death Corps breakthrough. Instead, they found themselves facing the Emperor's finest in prepared defensive positions, from which they simply would not be ousted. And finally, with the coming of night, veteran Sergeant Zir determined that the 11th had secured enough of a foothold that they would not be easily shifted. With his mission then complete, he began the withdrawal of his Red Scorpions and allowed Death Corps elements to move into the positions previously occupied by his battle brothers. And so it was a proud but severely mauled force of Astartes that slowly began to primarily march their way out of the crater. Almost all of the vehicles they had brought down to Vraks had been lost in the engagement, and the handful of rhinos left were either used to transport severely wounded battle brothers or used by the apothecaries that scoured the battlefield after the encroachment of night to reclaim the gene seed of their fallen brothers. And there was a lot of reclaiming to be done. Out of a total force of 96 battle brothers, Strike Force Aina had been reduced to just 34. And out of those 34, not a single one had escaped the engagement without serious injury. And in addition to the loss of most of the Strike Force armored elements, Dreadnought Brother Daries had also been destroyed. A tank's armor-piercing shell had ripped straight through his armored sarcophagus, leaving it as nothing more than an empty, uncontrolled shell that was eventually towed away by one of the apothecary-occupied rhinos at the end of the day. And remarkably enough, Sergeant Cullen, leading the assault marines into the breach ahead of all other Red Scorpion forces, had survived. His armor would require weeks if not months to repair, and his jump pack would have to be reclaimed and rebuilt virtually from scratch, But he was alive, and could look forward to an elevation to the 1st Company's elites after the return of the Red Scorpion Strike Force to their chapter's Fortress Monastery. The Strike Force had taken a battering unrivaled in Red Scorpion's history in a single engagement, but they had done what no other formation had managed. They had captured and held the breach for long enough for the 11th Assault Corps to pour through, and so had finally cracked the curtain walls on Vraks. All that stood before Marshal Kagori now and final victory was the citadel itself, at the heart of the enemy's defences. Whether or not it could be seized swiftly, however, that will have to be a question for another day. Regardless of what happens next, though, the situation on Vraks was about to change dramatically. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.